Hello, welcome. My name is Cassandra. I'm the Exhibitions and Programs Coordinator at the Illingworth Kerr Gallery at the Alberta University of the Arts. I would like to start today by offering an acknowledgement of the land that we are located on and its peoples that continue to steward and care for this place we all share. AUArts is situated on the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Siksika, the Piikani, the Kainai, the Tsuut'ina First Nations, and the Stoney Nakoda First Nations, including the Wesley, Bearspaw, and Chiniki. Southern Alberta and Treaty 7 is also home to the people of Métis Region 3. Acknowledgement of the land is a traditional custom of Indigenous people when welcoming outsiders onto their land and into their homes. We offer this acknowledgement as guests on Treaty 7 and as an act of reconciliation that honors the original peoples and stewards of this territory. So thank you for all joining us today. I'm excited to introduce Dr. Mark Clintberg and his seminar, Right Through This, Writing for Contemporary Art Markets. This seminar is hosted in conjunction with our Emerging Art Writers program, which is running in its second iteration this year. Mark will be providing more information on this program and how to apply at the end of this session. This presentation is approximately 1 hour. We will have an additional 30 minutes for questions at the end. If you have questions, please use the Q&A tab on the right-hand side of your screen. Moderators will be screening and publishing questions as they come in. If you find you have similar questions to other people, you can simply give those a thumbs up, which will bump them to the top, and we'll answer those questions first. If we don't get to your questions or you have additional questions for IKG staff, please email ikg@auarts.ca or check out our website, ikgallery.ca, for more information about the Emerging Art Writer program. So it is my great pleasure to introduce Mark. Dr. Mark Clintberg is an associate professor at AUArts, where he teaches art history and research methodologies. Journals and periodicals that have published his writing include The Senses in Society, C Magazine, ETC, BlackFlash, Canadian Art, the Art Newspaper, Border Crossings, the Phillip Review, Photofile, Art al Dia International, and Art.es Magazine. So thank you for joining us, Mark, and I will pass it on to you.
Thank you so much, Cassandra. And welcome, everybody. I'm really thrilled to be here and doing this presentation. I am also on Treaty 7 land today. So this is a presentation that I've given in various forms over maybe the last 4 years. And it's based on my personal experiences writing art criticism and doing curatorial writing freelance. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the term freelance, it just means, basically it means working independently on a contractual basis rather than being a permanent employee somewhere. So leading up to this presentation, I actually made a foolish decision and decided to look at some of my earliest writing of art criticism, which dates back to the early 2000s. And yeah, I mean, it kind of brought back into focus and reminded me of my earliest experiences as a writer, as someone being paid to write. And so I'm going to reflect on that a little bit throughout today's presentation. But before that, just a little bit of information about me. As Cassandra said, you know, I'm Dr. Mark Clintberg. My pronouns are he, him, and you can call me Mark. That's fine. If you really want something more formal, Dr. Clintberg is okay. So I've been teaching at AUArts since 2015, and before that, I taught at Concordia starting in 2008, which is also where I did my graduate work in art history. Before that, I did a curatorial training program at the Rebel Family Collection, which is a private art collection and museum in Miami. Private meaning that it's privately run by art collectors rather than being a civic organization or a state-run organization. So that was really where I guess my interests in writing about art came into focus. And before that, I was the associate curator at the Art Gallery of Calgary, which has now gone through several different morphing stages and is essentially contemporary Calgary now. So I worked there shortly after graduating from my BFA at ACAD, which is actually where I did my undergraduate degree. So very happy to be back at the institution. Okay, a little bit of information about what the plan is for today. I have split this up into 2 sections. There's a lecture and then there's questions. Of course, as Cassandra said, you can pose your questions in the Q&A throughout the presentation. I just won't see them until the end because all that I see is actually just this big screen of my presentation. I don't see any of you, just see my screen. So anyhow, I digress. So before that, the lecture, what I'm going to do is give you my step-by-step guide for approaching writing a text for publication. It's only one method. There are lots of different ways of doing this, but I'm going to show you how I do it, what my approach is as a writer. Then I'm going to talk about money. Sometimes people are a little nervous about talking about money. I love talking about money. I think it's really important for professionalization that we talk candidly with our students and with each other about how money works in the different fields that we are training our students in. So I'm going to talk a bit about money and contracts. Then I'm going to talk about building relationships with editors at different publications and also with artists. There are probably lots of other things that you want to know about that aren't in that list. For example, well, you should fill in that blank. So what I'd like for you to do now and throughout the presentation is start asking yourself about one thing you want to know about freelance art writing. What do you want to take away from this very brief presentation? And also, you know, some of these questions might come up about the larger Emerging Art Writers program and how it's going to function. And I'll say more about that at the end of the presentation. Okay, like I said, these are only suggestions, just a general guideline for how I approach things. The first step is finding the art. And here I've included in person because I know that right now it's not really possible for us to do that, but eventually in the future, I am certain that it will be possible for us to experience art in person. And meanwhile, you know, while it's not advisable to be, well, I mean, a lot of museums aren't even open, so we can't really do that. There are, of course, lots of forms of art that are designed for the digital environment. And so that's another path that you might take while we're waiting for things to become a bit safer. If you're looking for examples of digital or online programming, one space that I think has done an exemplary job of this is the New Gallery. And our other artist-run centers have also done excellent work in online programming, but I've found, I mean, I guess I've just spent more time looking at the New Gallery stuff. So yeah, that's another path that you can take while we're waiting for museums and galleries to open up in a more sustained way. After you find that art, then of course you want to spend some time thinking about it. I mean, maybe this seems like the most obvious thing in the world, but you probably noticed that so far I haven't said anything about writing. So first you want to find something. You want to seek out some work that you find interesting, and then start thinking about it. You know, maybe that happens in the exhibition itself. Maybe that happens, you know, when you're on your bicycle ride home or when you're on your way to work, or maybe it's a matter of several days later. But yeah, you want to spend some time thinking about it, because what you're trying to do is you're trying to decide after you've seen this art, whether this is something that you're interested in writing about. Because we see lots of art and, you know, we see lots of forms of, you know, exhibitions, and these aren't always going to be interesting enough for us to take the time to write something. So I find that this process of reflection, it actually saves time. You know, I don't want to be mercenary about my approach to art writing, but every hour that I spend writing something is time that I could be spending doing something else. So I like to make the most of my time as a writer and like really undertake a writing project once I'm sure I'm committed to it. So the third stage that I usually follow is that I formulate one idea about the art that I've seen and I write it down. And then I take extensive notes about the show. So ideally, I'm note-taking while I'm still inside of the exhibition or while I'm still looking at the work. And this is really about formal description. This is about describing what it looks like, you know, how many pieces are in the show, making note of the titles of the works that I found interesting. Maybe, I mean, now I would probably ask permission if it's possible for me to take some photos of the exhibition to jog my memory. But this is a time when writing ideas down, initial notations down, is very, very useful, because sometimes ideas occur to us in the moment while we're viewing an exhibition, and they, we kind of forget about them later on. But this is not writing the text itself. You're not sitting down to write polished prose. At least that's not what I do. I will maybe have a notebook with me, and I'll take 1 page of brief notes, like usually just point form. Maybe I start to think about some phrasing that I think is reflective of the exhibition, maybe some vocabulary that I imagine that I want to use. And I'll say more about this later on, but I actually have a document of vocabulary. And the reason for that is that I like to keep track of words that I use frequently. I mean, we all do this as writers. I certainly do it as a speaker. You could have like Clintberg lecture bingo in a way, and make note of probably like 25 or 30 words that I use a lot. As a writer, I really try to expand beyond the immediate toolkit of vocabulary that I'm prone to use as a speaker, just because, yeah, I mean, I think it keeps things more lively. It keeps things more interesting for me as a writer. Yeah, so don't start writing your text at this point. Instead, I think it's worthwhile to write this. This is what I would write. This exhibition or this artist deserves attention because why? Why is this worth my time? Why is this worth the reader's time? Why is this worth the visitor's time to go and see this show? Because of course, that's part of what writing art criticism is often about, is drawing attention to exhibitions and artists that we think deserve attention. That's not the only thing that art criticism does. Sometimes the attention is more critical in a negative kind of sense, like this is a problematic exhibition. But in any case, what you're trying to figure out is, why do I want to write about this? We all know what the feeling is to be excited about working on something, whether that's, a la Audre Lorde assembling a bookshelf, or whether that is, I don't know, making a cake or making an artwork or designing a poster or writing something. We all can identify, I think, that kind of feeling of excitement. It's a harder thing to articulate why it's exciting for us. But writing that down at this stage, I think, is really useful, because then you have something that you've written that identifies for your publication that you're going to approach, for your editor that you're going to approach. It identifies for them why this is important, why this is interesting. Then after figuring out why I'm interested in this, I like to make a list of possible publications for this text. And, this is just one sample of a few texts that might come to mind. This is by no means exhaustive. And, after that ellipsis, which I realize has 4 dots instead of 3, my first typo in this presentation that I've noticed is, of course, etc., but also at cetera, as it's pronounced in French, and I didn't do a great job of pronouncing it, is also a publication that publishes in English and French. So it's yet another publication. So I thought that was kind of a cute joke to include. How are you going to choose? How are you going to choose these sources? Well, maybe there are sources that you've already read. There are some magazines that you've already read. Maybe there are some blogs or online publications that you've already read. And the publications that you've enjoyed or that have resonated with you because of the other authors that are represented there, or practices, or the way it's designed, maybe even, you're asking yourself about where you're going to feel at home and what kind of company you want to be keeping. Who do you want your work to be read alongside? What other authors, what other artists, what other designers? Then it's useful for you to read the masthead. That really means read the submissions guidelines. But also in the masthead, which in a print publication is usually in the first couple of pages, sometimes it's at the very back of the publication, it identifies who the editor is, who's on the board, who's on the editorial board, who the contributing editors are. And, those names, I think, when we're flipping through a magazine, they don't really jump out at us. And I think many of us probably just skip past that information. But it is important for a person who wants to be active as a freelance writer to know these names, I would say. And it's not about like name recognition or name dropping or anything like that, but instead to recognize how intertwined a lot of the writing world is inside of inside of the Canadian nation state, basically. So in Canadian publishing, things are fairly enmeshed when it comes to magazines like Canadian Art and C Magazine and so on. In fact, we'll often see people that have been doing editorial work at Canadian Art go on to work at C Magazine, go on to work at BlackFlash, and so on and so forth. And yeah, I mean, this is more than just gossip. This is about kind of seeing career paths of different people, because personally, I found it really useful to look at the professional practices of people that I have emulated. You know, for instance, when I was thinking about graduate school, I thought, okay, I don't really know where I want to go to graduate school, but I know why I want to go there. I want to go there because I want to teach. So I'm going to look at some people that are teaching in universities and institutions that I appreciate, and I'm going to sort of follow their career path retrospectively, and figure out like, well, what did they do? You know, how did they go about doing things? So reading the masthead is another way of identifying how people have moved around and how their responsibilities have shifted. But in the masthead, there's usually an explanation about how submissions work for a publication, whether they accept them or not. Not all publications do accept submissions unsolicited, that is, without inviting them. So you want to figure out what publications do accept submissions, which ones don't, and of those that accept submissions for freelance texts, which ones are the ones that you find interesting. Here's one example of Canadian Arts contributor guidelines. So you can see that even a pitch is going to adhere to their editorial submission guidelines. So a pitch is basically saying, hey, Canadian Art, I have this great idea. You should publish my work and you should pay me to do it. And here's that idea. If you're interested, I'll tell you more about it, basically. So some publications have very specific guidelines, not just for how the final text looks and how it's published and how it's written, but also even for how the pitch happens. So it's important to notify yourself or to inform yourself about these different requirements for the different publications that you're thinking of approaching. Here's the submissions guidelines for C Magazine. I'm just profiling, well, I'm profiling these for specific reasons, which is that both C Magazine and Canadian Art have this new writers initiative. It's expressed in different ways for each of these publications, but basically what it is it's the opportunity for someone who is a relatively new writer, an emerging writer, to publish with these two magazines. So these are two publications that have programs designed for emerging writers. And yeah, I mean, they're also publications that published my work when I was emerging. So it's one of the other reasons why I'm highlighting them. Additionally, there's a C Writer directory because C Magazine is interested in expanding their pool of writers that contribute. So I've included some information here. It's just a screen grab from the C Magazine website, and you can go to their website to learn more about that if you're already at the point where you feel very comfortable and prepared to start approaching magazines and you want to be part of this writer directory. Okay, back to the steps. Now you're going to formulate an email and a pitch, including one core idea about the art. You still aren't writing your text. You aren't writing your art criticism yet. You're not writing your feature text, if that's the format that you've decided that you're going to take. A feature article is usually a longer article. It's usually more than 1,000 words. Generally, reviews in the Canadian publishing context are less than 1,000. Sometimes they're even less than 500 now. It seems like reviews get shorter and shorter and shorter as time goes on. So a feature is usually not about one specific exhibition. It's about like a whole set of ideas. Sometimes it's focused on one practice or one theme. Lots of different ways of approaching that. Then you're going to send that email and your pitch to the editor, but you're still not going to write your text. You're going to wait. And I thought I would include an image of me waiting to hear back from an editor. This is usually how I feel when I'm waiting to hear back about whether an editor is interested in publishing my work. And I would say that, before I started working as a full-time instructor at a university, I felt this even more deeply because it wasn't just about, my excitement about sharing my work or maybe my pride being a little bit bruised if the answer was no. It was also really about putting food on the table and paying my rent. Because for a few years, my primary form of income really was from writing, with a little bit of trickling in from my artistic practice. And I will be frank with you and say that having only one income stream as a freelance writer, and that being a freelance writer is the only income stream for a person, for me, that was very, very hard. And I lived in Montreal in an apartment that I think was $850 a month at the time. And it was still very hard for me to make ends meet. Nonetheless, I did find a way to do it. So that's why this scream face, comes to mind for me when I have waited for responses from editors. Okay, so this is an example of how I generally approach writing that message to an editor. My name is, I am a freelance writer based in, I recently saw the exhibition, this artist describes, this artist, and then you're going to go on and describe the artist's work and maybe some details about who this artist is. And you've already done a bit of that work in your note-taking exercises while seeing the exhibition or shortly after seeing the exhibition. Now you're going to say why you think this work deserves attention. Then you ask, would a review or a feature article on this practice be of interest to fill in the name of the publication? I've attached a writing sample for your interest and would be happy to discuss this work further with you. Sincerely, your name. Okay, this is really just one way. There are so many different ways of doing this. And I do think, something that is slightly longer than this is acceptable. Now, of course, places like Canadian Art, they have their own pitch guidelines. So you want to check that beforehand. But if there are no guidelines for pitches on the masthead or on the website, this kind of form letter, I think, is acceptable. I like to keep my pitch letters very short, or emails. I like to keep my pitch emails very short because editors are extremely busy people. They are generally underpaid. They are usually, working around the clock to try and get their publication out. So they don't have a lot of time to read email. The last thing that an editor wants is a several paragraph long email that is a pitch asking, for a publishing job, like for a freelance job, for some freelance income. So I like to keep things very, very tidy and simple. Okay, there's going to be some waiting. There are a lot of things that you can do while you're waiting for that reply, because I would say, in my experience, waiting for an editor to reply, it's usually a few weeks. Sometimes it's even more than a month. Sometimes it can be 6 weeks. So I like to write my pitch and then kind of forget about it. Like, sort of the way that maybe you would about an ex that you just broke up with. Just be like, okay, I just can't think about this anymore. I'm just going to move on. I'm going to start a new chapter in my life. Okay. I mean, I'm not saying that all relationships with exes are like that, so maybe that's not a very good comparison, but wringing one's hands over waiting for a reply to an editor is, I don't think, very healthy for me. I'd much rather be like in the bathtub or going for a run or making dinner or spending time with our dog or something like that. So while you're waiting for the reply, you can do those kinds of things. But if you're really, really keen to start working and you want to get some ideas down, well, then you could flesh out your formal description of the artwork. You could write 1 or 2 more sentences about the key ideas that excite you. You could write 1 or 2 sentences about a theorist or an author's ideas that are going to help you in writing your review. But please do not start writing your text yet, because if the editor writes back and the answer is no, then you have, in a way, unnecessarily spent time on this writing exercise. And I don't think that writing an art review on spec, that is without a contract, is the best writing exercise that one can perform. There are lots of other writing exercises you could work on that won't ultimately end up breaking your heart if the answer is no from your editor. I am not a big fan of having multiple pitches out for a single idea. So let's say I saw exhibition, let's just call it Exhibition A. And after seeing Exhibition A, I thought, wow, I really want to write about this. I would not send a pitch to 3 or 4 different publications and then just like wait to see who writes back. I send one idea to one publication, and then I might send a different idea to a different publication, but I try not to cross those wires. And the reason why is because if an editor, let's say 2 editors were to write back to me and say, oh, we're both interested in publishing this, well, then I have a very hard decision to make because I can only really publish with one of those with that one pitch. You don't want to set up a situation for yourself where you're publishing a single text in a competing market. That is publishing talk for basically like a competing market is the contemporary art market. That's one market. They're competing with each other, right? Those publications, you know, they really are competing with each other for readers' attention. But you could submit a pitch to a non-competing market, like let's say you submit a pitch to Canadian Art about an artist that you care about. Well, you could send a pitch to En route, which I mean is kind of a strange example to bring up right now because almost nobody is flying, but Air Canada's magazine, En route, they do publish articles about artists and about galleries and exhibitions. And those are considered non-competing markets because even though they might show up on the same airplane, they are really geared at separate readers. And the text that one would end up writing for Canadian Art would be so different in form and like really in genre and in voice from what one would write for Air Canada that they're seen as non-competing. And yeah, I would say that as a freelance writer, that would be an acceptable practice. But if you are looking at publishing in non-competing markets and you aren't absolutely sure about whether that's going to burn up your relationship with an editor in the field of contemporary art, ask. You should definitely ask. Getting back to this question about writing something about theorists or authors' ideas that are going to help you in your review, probably many people that are in this workshop are students, current or former students at AUArts. And yeah, you're probably receiving some training about how to apply an author's argument to analyze an artwork. If any of you are unsure about that, or you just want some more ideas or support about that, I highly recommend this book, which probably you cannot make out. It's Methods and Theories of Art History. It's by Anne de Leyva. So the last name is D''Alleva. And it's called Methods and Theories of Art History. It is a very short book. It is small, but basically what it does is it introduces how one starts with a methodology or a theory and then applies it to an artwork. And it goes through a number of different methodologies, including semiotics, feminist theory, queer theory, and demonstrates how to use those theories. So it's a really handy handbook that I recommend to all of my students, but also to other writers. And I still look at this, even in my scholarly writing practice sometimes, just to kind of remind myself of a few ideas. If you're looking for models of how artists, specifically how artists write art criticism, there's this whole form of critical art writing written by an artist, right? This is like many people do this. And there are a lot of different publications that bring together anthologies of artist writing. For example, Stan Douglas is somebody who writes about his own work and about other artists' work. And then, let's see, Liz McGore is somebody who does that too. And then another artist that has just been published is Ken Lum. His anthology of his artist writing that often includes art criticism has just been published by Concordia University Press, which is where I did my graduate work. So it's kind of a shameless plug. So it's called Everything is Relevant, and it is available for free online through our library subscription service at AUArts, but it's also available for free as a digital publication through Concordia's library for anybody, even if you don't have a library card. Okay, so those are a few ideas. Now, another thing that you could do is just write a poem. So this is a poem that I wrote a couple of years ago for this workshop. It's titled Waiting. Really, it's better to wait until you have a contract. Do not write. This is a kind of phrase or set of sentences that I think are worth repeating when we're waiting. It really is better, in my experience, to wait to write your text until you have a contract. If you want to write, if you have the urge to write something else. Don't write on the topic that you have pitched. Okay, hurrah, you got your reply from the editor. If the answer is no, then you can safely approach another editor with the same pitch in a competing market. If it seems appropriate, you might ask if they can recommend another publication that's a better fit. And you might say, well, how am I going to assess if it's appropriate? Well, if an editor says to you something like, wow, this sounds really interesting, your writing sample was great, but we're not really covering that genre of work right now. Like maybe you pitched a video work to them and they don't really specialize in video. Or maybe you pitched something that's about painting and you pitched it to a photo magazine like Photofile. Well, you could ask then, can you recommend another publication that serves this market a little bit better? And then if the answer is yes, writer, we want to publish your work. Then you start asking some questions. And I'm going to say more about what those questions are in a moment. After you've asked your questions, then you're going to start negotiating the terms of your contract. Most publications in the Canadian market have standard contracts internally. That is, each magazine has their own kind of standard contract. In my experience, there's very little wiggle room within that contract, very little that can be changed other than some details that I'm going to explain in a moment. But for the most part, a contract that a publication provides is something that the board has already approved and that they've determined internally. And there's not a great deal of flexibility, but there are some things that you can negotiate. Okay, so what are the questions that I recommend asking? You always want to ask, what's the total required word count? Usually reviews are around 500 to 1,000 words. With different publications that varies. Features can be as long as 2,000 words, but sometimes they're only 1,000. It is not the same, and it changes even within one publication from year to year. Sometimes they change their formatting. What's the deadline? When do you have to have this to the editor? Is that a flexible deadline? It's worth asking that now. You don't want to ask 5 days before the deadline, oh, by the way, is this a flexible deadline? Start off by asking, what's the deadline, and is this a hard deadline? Is it a flexible deadline? Next, what's the copy edit process? What's the peer review process? How is this going to be edited? That's useful to know because let's say your deadline is April 1st. Well, the copy edit process that they have, or the peer review process that they have, where people are looking at your writing and editing it, that might involve a 2-week turnaround, or maybe it's a month turnaround. So that means if your deadline was April 1st, on April 15th, you might get an email from the editor saying, hi, here's a copy edited, reviewed version of your text. You now have a week to either accept or revise, make changes. And sometimes that's completely inflexible, and it's good to know that beforehand. Sometimes the peer review process moves very quickly, sometimes it's very slowly. With scholarly material, it's extremely slow if you're publishing with journals. And of course, when you publish in a journal, you don't get paid. But if you're publishing for a periodical, the duration of that review process varies in the extreme. I mean, sometimes if an editorial board is really on it, they might have work back to me in 7 days or less. And then they expect me to respond sometimes within less than 7 days. So I want to know in advance what the expectations are so I can book time in my calendar. It's also important to ask if the text is going to be translated into any other language, because if it is going to be translated and it's translated into a language that you happen to be able to read, then you want to be able to notify the editor, oh, well, if it's being published in that language, then I also want to be able to proof the translation before it goes to print. What's the final anticipated publication date? This is different than your deadline. Sometimes, again, if your deadline is April 1st, it won't be published until August, or it might be published in July, or maybe it's published at the end of April. It really depends on what format the publication is taking. If it's generally online is the fastest. Newspapers are maybe a close second, like a daily newspaper, then weeklies, and then periodicals like Canadian Art. Okay, what's the method of submission? Am I submitting a Word file? Is it a LIX file? I don't think anyone really uses LIX anymore. I don't, but it's an LYX format that was used in writing markets for a while. Or do they want some other format? That's going to save you a step later on. Once you have answered all of these questions with your editor, you're going to make a document that explains to yourself what all of this is. So I open up a Word document and I write, title of publication. So let's say I'm publishing with the Journal of Canadian Art History. I include that. I write my name. I write what the word count is going to be. I write out what the deadline is. I write about whether it's going to be translated. I include that all in my document, so I'm not scrambling through emails later on trying to find that information later. Next, you're going to negotiate the terms of your contract. Again, some of this you can move around a little bit, a lot of it you can't, but you want to know this information at the very least. Are you being paid by the word? If so, how much are you being paid per word? Is there a maximum number of words that you will be paid for? For instance, let's say your word count is 500 words. If you're being paid 50 cents a word, is there room for you to be paid beyond word number 500 in the budget? There might not be. I'd say usually there isn't. Is there a lump sum payment? What I mean by that is, well, it's not payment by the word. It's just that you have a word count, it's 1,000 words, you get paid $500. And if you go slightly under 1,000, you're still paid that same sum of money, that same $500. Who has the copyright of the text? Now, last year when I gave this presentation, Renee Martin, our librarian, had some very, very useful contextual information about this, about copyright holding. And so if you have any questions about copyright as a freelance writer, I really recommend reaching out to Renee. I hope that Renee doesn't mind me highlighting her here. But I do think it's good just to ask, where does the copyright lie? And some of that has to do with republication. Now, very often as a writer, you will have the copyright, by default, but it's worthwhile knowing whether you have the right to republish. Because let's say you publish something with a periodical, and then the next year somebody is putting together an anthology of to do with the artist work that you wrote about, and they're publishing it for the scholarly market, but they want to be able to reprint your text. Well, you want to make sure in advance about whether that first publication is okay with the second publication republishing it. It's just good to have that information first. It's not the end of the world if you don't know at the beginning, but it helps to know it in advance. Okay, image rights. Who's responsible for getting the right to publish the image? Very often in the market that rests with the publication. You don't have to figure that out on your own, but sometimes authors are responsible for sourcing their own images. So it's good to know that in advance, because that's extra legwork, it's extra work, it's extra time. And that labor, you should be accounting for that in your budgeting, or not your budgeting, your, I guess your financial plan for how you're approaching your writing. Who pays for the rights? Again, usually in the Canadian market, it is the publication that pays for the image rights, but not always. I've had more than one situation with scholarly publishing where I am the writer, I'm not being paid as a scholar, right? Like scholarly publications don't pay writers, but I had to pay the image rights. I had to pay the holder of the image rights rather than the publication paying. Okay, again, figure out whether it's a negotiable deadline and also whether there's a kill fee. I know that sounds very dramatic, melodramatic, but this is what it's called in the industry. A kill fee means a fee that you are paid after you've signed the contract if the publication is canceled. If the editor comes back to you a week after the contract and says, listen, it turns out we don't have space for your text, then you will still be paid a kill fee. This has come up for me more than once. It's useful to have that there as a kind of insurance policy, I guess you could call it. Usually it's half of the full fee, sometimes it's less, but it's better than nothing because very often you've already set aside time, maybe you've already started spending time after you've signed the contract writing, and then the editor says, yeah, sorry, we can't publish it. It's nice to be compensated even if you just started the text. Okay, now you finally get to write your text. You've been waiting all this time, and step number 8 is that you get to start writing your text. All right, lots of ways of writing a text. Everybody has their own approach to this. I like writing in short, regular stages. Now, sometimes because of the line of work that I'm in as an instructor, I actually don't have, you know, what we might call the luxury of these short, regular stages. Sometimes I really do have to sit down for a full afternoon and, you know, kind of hammer out a text or the beginnings of a text in one long sitting. Now, the reason why I'm hesitant about doing that, especially, you know, as I've gone through my practice, is that we all know it feels great to sit down and write for 5 hours, you know, when we have the time and space and we're properly fed and we have childcare, dog care, all that kind of stuff lined up. It is a luxury to sit down for 4 to 5 hours and write. It feels amazing, usually, if we have the time and space to do it. And it often results in a form of euphoria, right? Like we just feel so good. But then what happens, what can emerge, is a very troubling pattern where if we don't have that 4 to 5 hour window set aside of complete peace and solitude, no responsibilities, well fed, well slept, then we experience dysphoria. We get really, really sad. And we get really bummed out that we don't have the time and space to spend that 5 hours. And then it starts to feel like we've, you know, writing isn't about winning or losing, but somehow it feels like we've lost or we've lost something. And it can be really tragic. It can actually really hurt feelings, like one's own feelings, if we have that as an expectation that we're going to have that 5 hour window to write or that full morning to write. Then when we don't get it, I am really sad if I've set that up for myself as an expectation. So now I find that it's better to work in these short and regular stages. So I like to spend sometimes even just 5 minutes thinking about an idea and writing on that idea, even before I've had a cup of coffee sometimes, although more and more I have to have coffee first to get to it, but before checking email, before social media. The way I approach it, what I say to myself as a writer when I get up in the morning, if I know that I have a text that I want to work on, I say, this is time for me to do something for myself. This is for me. Email is usually not for me. It's usually about fulfilling obligations to other people. Social media is also not about feeding me in a way that encourages my writing practice, although sometimes we find other interesting, useful things on social media. So I like to set those other things aside. I will call them distractions because I find them distracting myself, and just spend 15 minutes first thing in the morning writing for a little bit. And it's always nice to finish a writing session while you still have some ideas on the go. That way, when you come back to that draft the next day, you have a place to pick up and continue. After you've hit that required length, then go back and edit. And I mean, you can approach this in a fluid kind of way. Maybe you edit things in an intermittent fashion throughout as you're working on these short, regular writing sessions. Then, when it's ready, you're going to send your text to the editor. Or, if you absolutely have to, if you have no choice, you really have no choice, then you're going to renegotiate your deadline. Really, this is something you want to avoid. You do not want to renegotiate a deadline less than 2 weeks before the deadline with an editor. And, you know, honestly, I think this is a good thing to keep in mind with submissions in university too. Just because asking for a deadline at the last minute doesn't feel good for us as students when we are students. It also doesn't feel great for an editor who's being asked at the last minute, oh, I really need to renegotiate my deadline, because they've set up their whole calendar expecting that they're going to get it from you at this time on this day. And sometimes it's a specific time, like 5 p.m. on February 1st. Renegotiated deadlines, we all have to do that. As a freelance writer, do it less than 3% of the time. Otherwise, your reputation is going to start to suffer, and editors will start to know, well, every time that we work with this author, they always ask for a renegotiated deadline. They always end up submitting late. You want to be the type of writer that almost always meets deadlines, or at least that there's the perception that you are always on time. When I say perception, I mean like maybe there's one publication a year where you had to ask for a renegotiated deadline. Then you're going to receive your copy edit. Expect commentary, expect changes. If there are not changes, something's not right. Something's not right. You might think, oh, what a compliment. There were no changes. I am just the best. And maybe you are a great writer. But if there are no changes, it's usually because the editor is just so busy, or they were unprepared, or they don't have the skill yet. Likewise with editorial boards. If it goes through a board and nobody has a single change, you know, okay, maybe that results in less work for you, but it doesn't make the text better. Every good article has an amazing editor behind it. I really believe this. Editors are experts at making writing better. Okay, then you're going to formulate what your responses are to the edits, and you're going to integrate that using track changes in the document unless you've been told otherwise, and then you're going to resubmit it. So there are almost always at least 2 submissions with freelance writing. Sometimes there are more. I have gone through experiences where I've had as many as 4 revisions, and I won't go into the details of that, but basically it had to do with different stages where the editor looked at it, then a copy editor looked at, no, then the board looked at it, then a copy editor looked at it, and then a translator looked at it. So it ended up being actually a lot of work. That's why you want to know about things like translation and what the editing process is. Then after it's been published, don't forget to put it in your curriculum vitae, of course, you've got to have it in your CV. If you're allowed to, within your contract, distribute it using your website or email, but only if you have the right to do that, and very often we don't. Then you're going to follow up with your editor, and you're going to say thank you. You're going to ask for a PDF that is typeset and corrected. I have a lot of publications that I did a long time ago where I have my first draft that I submitted, but I don't have the revised version. I don't have a typeset version that includes illustrations. And that was bad archiving on my part. So I recommend that you ask for this immediately after it's been published so you don't forget. Then you're going to invoice them. Almost all publications I've ever worked with require some kind of invoice. Unless you're being paid an honorarium, then it's a different story. And don't forget to set aside a generous sum for the payment of taxes. My default is 20 to 25%, which I know might seem extreme. Keep in mind the first time I did this presentation, I lived in Quebec. Or actually it was to a Quebec audience, I guess I should say. So be thinking about that. You've got to set aside money for taxes, and it's better to have too much rather than not enough. Then you can start rewriting and pitching to alternative non-competing writers markets. And then you repeat that. So this cycle, you know, these 17 steps that I've laid out, the amount of time that this takes varies a lot, but it can be anywhere from, I would say, 8 weeks to 6 months to go through every one of these steps. So freelance writing is a kind of long game. You have to understand, or I think it's useful to keep in mind, that the publishing racket is one that moves relatively slowly, and that, you know, the process from start to finish means that you're often waiting on multiple payments. You're often waiting to be paid for many invoices at the same time. And that's one of the reasons why it's good to have multiple pitches out or multiple projects out that are all at different stages. So let's say on January 1st, you pitch to publication A, then on February 1st, they say yes. Well, then on February 1st, you should already be thinking about pitching a different article or idea to another publication. That's going to help you with the sustainability of your freelance writing practice. Okay, there are all of those steps all over again, which I can put back up on the screen during the Q&A or put in the chat or something if people want to take further notes. I know I went through some of these very quickly. Okay, so sustainable practices. We still have a little less than 10 minutes to go through this. These are ideas that I have about how to support oneself and possibly others, including dependents, with a practice as a freelance writer. I've tried all of these strategies, or I've used all of these different points. Okay, so one great idea, when it is possible and safe to do so, is to plan a trip according to a series of reviews, interviews, catalog essays, or features. So I, especially early in my freelance writing practice, used to have like this routine where, okay, I would secure a contract to write for the art newspaper at Art Basel in Switzerland. And so that's, I think maybe those were usually about 6-day assignments. And then, well, I'm already in Europe and they have paid for my flight to get there. So while I'm there, you know what, I'm also going to go to Venice and see the Biennale there. And I'm going to secure a review of the Biennale for a Kim blog. And, you know, while I'm there, I also am going to be around a lot of people that I want to interview. So I'm going to try and secure an interview with yet another publication. Anyway, the idea here is that the trip can pay for itself through your writing and then some sometimes, especially if you planned it out really, really well. So this is something that I haven't done as much in the last few years. Actually, I don't think I've done it at all since I started a full-time teaching practice. But if you want to travel when it is safe and advisable to do so, this is a really good way to do that and to pay for your trip and also earn an income while you're traveling around. Multiple non-competing writers markets is another way of increasing the income that you can gain from seeing a single exhibition. And there are also forms of republication that happen within the newspaper market. So for instance, you know, I used to write for the Edmonton Journal, and every once in a while, not very often, but every once in a while, another newspaper would pick up the article that I'd written for the journal, and then I would be paid again for that second publication. It would be a small amount of money. I mean, I think usually it was like $45 or $50, but it's still something. So that's an advantage of working for publications like that. Develop your relationships with multiple editors. It's not a great idea if you want to have a sustainable freelance writing practice to only work with one publication or even just work with 2 publications. You want to be working with multiple editors. And those relationships are useful because eventually you will get to a point, if you keep up with this, where, and if you sustain good relations, where editors are going to start coming to you. You don't have to pitch. Editors will start coming to you and they'll say, hi, we know you have some expertise and interest in this field. Would you be interested in writing a feature on this topic? The more that you write, the more that this will happen, especially with things like catalog essays or with feature articles. Another important thing to do is to conduct studio visits. This is another way of developing relationships that lead to catalog essays. If you have visits and meetings with artists, and they know that you're interested and they like what you have to say about your work, the next time they have a solo exhibition, they might invite you to write the catalog essay. Okay, now we're going to talk about money in a more direct way. A feature is usually upwards to $1,000. Sometimes it's less, sometimes it's $500. A review is, you know, usually less. So my kind of rule of thumb when I was working freelance in a more full-time kind of way as my primary income, I guess I should say, is that if I could write a feature and 1 review a month, that's going to result in a net income of about $1,000. Sometimes less, sometimes more. It depends on who I'm working with. And most Canadian writers markets are paying between 25 cents and $1 a word. That includes exhibition catalogs, that includes periodicals and newspapers. Sometimes it's more, it's often not more. The last time I checked, Vogue paid $2 a word, or no, Vogue I think was $1 a word and Reader's Digest is $2 a word. I have never written for either publication, but it's useful to have a sense about, you know, what your per word market or rate is compared to other publications. If you end up earning more than $30,000 a year as a self-employed individual across even multiple different fields like art writing and a design practice, for instance, you're going to need a GST number. This is something that I found out very late in the game, and it was intensely stressful to find out that actually I should have been paying GST long before, or I should have been collecting GST on my invoices long before I actually started doing it. So I'd add to the sustainable practices here that you need a good accountant. I've hired an accountant for many years, starting roughly when I started freelance writing, actually, because it just makes the whole process less stressful. Okay, so just going back to this statement, like this exhibition deserves attention, this is why I want to write about this. If you're going to make that kind of statement, you need to be looking at a lot of different things. You need to look at a lot of different art, exhibitions, and critical writing. This has to be part of your routine. You know, there are lots of ways of encouraging this kind of behavior for yourself. I like to keep art magazines near my favorite chair with proper lighting so that I will read it, you know, that I'll actually sit down and read something cover to cover. If I have a subscription to a magazine and I immediately put that magazine on the shelf, I'm less likely to read it. So yeah, it's important to be experiencing a lot of different art and exhibitions and reading the work of your peers. Now, an exercise for later on is an exercise in note-taking. I recommend that anyone who's interested in pursuing the freelance writing way, you know, find an artwork that maybe you have in your own home or that you have an image of, but that you've seen in person before, and try taking some notes on it. Try noting what it looks like, maybe some of the contextual factors or the conceptual dimension of the work. Another exercise that I'm only very briefly going to introduce, which is appropriate, is speed writing. So speed writing is something where you sit down and you give yourself 60 seconds, for instance. You set a timer and you say to yourself, I'm going to write one sentence about this artwork. I use speed writing a lot, although I don't time myself as much as I used to, as a way of kind of forcing myself to be productive, even if the writing itself is not amazing. It feels satisfying to get something down on the page. It's very hard to start with a blank document that has nothing on it, which is another reason why I always start my documents with the publisher, my name, the word count, all of that kind of stuff. So at least I have something. So speed writing is a really useful tactic for those of us who have difficulty getting started, and I am one of those people. Okay, so normally when I give this presentation in person, I say, well, what is it that we're going to write first then? The answer is on the next slide. The answer is you're going to write your pitch, right? Like you have written maybe some initial notes about the exhibition, but you have not started writing your catalog essay or your art criticism yet. Instead, you're going to focus on writing the pitch first. Okay, so that is the presentation, and I have finished exactly at 3 o'clock. So I think since we really started at maybe 3 or 4 minutes past, I have a couple of minutes left to talk about the Emerging Art Writers Program application. So those of you who are interested in participating in this is the second year that we're offering this program. We have guest mentors again this year. They are different from the mentor that we had this year. And maybe Cassandra, I'll leave it to you if we're talking about who those people are yet. So you're going to submit a letter of interest. It can be very brief. You know, this can just be a couple of sentences explaining why you're interested in the program. You're going to give us a brief writing sample. And, you know, we've left it deliberately ambiguous here about how to define brief. I would say, you know, a couple of pages, even an extract of something longer is fine. It does not need to be a 20-page writing sample. It doesn't need to be a 10-page paper. Then you're also going to tell us which stream you're interested in, because there are 2 paths this year for the Emerging Art Writers Program. One is focused on, curatorial, and the other one is on art criticism. So you're more interested in writing editorial material for exhibitions, that is like a catalog text, that kind of thing, working with a curator, or are you more interested in working in art criticism? If you're interested in both, please indicate which of those you're most interested in. Then you need to confirm that you're available and that you're committed to the program and the dates that are listed on the IKG website, because all of the sessions are mandatory. So if you're going to participate, you need to know that we need to know that you're available for every single one of those sessions. You're going to email that application, and the deadline is January 22nd at 4 p.m. So we have made it 4 p.m., which I know is very specific, because very often writers' deadlines are that specific. So you have, let's see, today is the 13th. So you have 9 days, is that right, to complete this? Pardon me. Another important thing to know is that people who are accepted into the program are going to be paid for their writing. They will be paid 50 cents a word up to 1,000 words. The final piece should be roughly 1,000 words, and the workshop is going to be focused on generating this 1,000 word piece. It's going to be published in a publication, a physical publication that the IKG is putting together. And the participants are also going to be paid an honorarium for attending all of the sessions and reviewing the work of their peers.